All right, so chapter 8, we're going to talk about stop and frisk, which plays into or follows up from our discussion on reasonable suspicion earlier. So, the foundation for reasonable suspicion is right there from Terry versus Ohio. And under Terry versus Ohio, we are permitted to demand the person's name, their address, and the nature of their business. So 3 questions they have to answer. Otherwise, you can charge them with obstruction or whatever, provided that reasonable suspicion exists. Then we move on down here to Sibrin versus New York, where the court defined a frisk as limited to the outer clothing. And in Peters versus New York, it says that if reasonable suspicion to permit the frisk is valid, then inadvertent discovery applies. Actually, that should be inevitable discovery there for the plain field doctrine. One thing that you need to know, though, about Terry versus Ohio and the stop and frisk is that you have to have reasonable suspicion to stop the person. Then you must have additional reasonable suspicion to frisk them, unless the reasonable suspicion for the frisk is the reasonable suspicion for the stop. Okay, so if you get called to, let's say, an industrial neighborhood in the middle of the night for shots fired, and then you find a pedestrian out and about, clearly you're going to be patting them down because you're looking for somebody with a weapon who committed an unlawful discharge. So that's going to be both your reasonable suspicion for the stop and the frisk. But if your reasonable suspicion is only for the stop, then you have to develop additional independent reasonable suspicion to conduct a frisk. And this is rooted in the reasonableness standard that pits the citizen's right to privacy against the government's interest in effective crime prevention and officer safety. Okay, so there is a balancing test that must take place here. So for stops, we have the free to leave test, which comes from United States v. Mendenhall. And then if there's a show of authority. So like this photo here in the background of the slides, you see 2 officers, 2 suspects, clearly not an overwhelming show of authority. However, if you had 1 black guy and 6 white officers, not that the race really has anything to do about it, but there is a bit of an additional intimidation there, recognized by society. But the thing is, you got 1 suspect and 6 officers. It doesn't matter if it's 1 6'5" male and 6 5'4" females officers. It doesn't matter. If you have that many officers, clearly there's a show of authority and the subject is not free to leave. So they also must be free to decline requests or terminate the encounter. Not necessarily for a reasonable suspicion stop, but if you have a consensual encounter, then that would definitely apply. But the question asked here is, are we asking basic investigatory questions? And then, of course, do we have means intentionally applied? Is this an intentionally applied detention? Are we stopping this person on purpose, or is it inadvertent? There are many times that during the day, especially after I rotate to the day shift after having been on nights, that I make a traffic stop and then I forget to turn my overhead lights off. And so then I start going down the road and I see people pulling off to the side. And I'm like, what's going on? I pull up and talk to them. I'm like, can I help you? Something wrong? And they're like, well, your lights are on. I'm like, oh, oops, sorry. So that's not an intentional detention. I didn't mean to stop this person. I just flat forgot my lights were on. They were being a conscientious citizen and pulling to the right and stopping like they've been directed to. So you have to intentionally apply the detention for it to be a reasonable suspicion stop. So we talked about frisks being a limited pat down of the outer clothing. And here the authority is limited to reasonable suspicion that officer safety warrants the pat down. So you have to have additional reasonable suspicion, like I was talking about, and that is that for some reason the officer's safety is in jeopardy unless a pat down is conducted. So this could be for any number of reasons. Here during the winter, we conduct a lot of these limited pat downs for officer safety because it's cold outside and people want to put their hands in their pockets to keep them warm, but we don't want their hands in their pockets because they may have weapons. So a lot of times we'll just do a quick pat down of, like their front pockets to make sure there's nothing there, and then allow them to put their hands in those pockets only. So here you see several behavioral clues that are specific circumstances for a stop and frisk. So flight is not referring to, getting onto Pan Am 483. It's whenever you run from the police or you attempt to elude us. Furtive gestures whenever you're trying to hide something. Association with known criminals. All of those are big deals. Innocent conduct is there in quotation marks because it means that somebody is doing something that in itself is innocent conduct, but taken in the totality of circumstances, their innocent conduct is suspicious. Then, of course, there's an admission by a defendant that they're up to no good, possible evidentiary cues. So there might be indicators of drug activity that you don't necessarily see drugs, but might see evidence of drug activity. If they're in a high crime area or a suspect description in an immediate area at the time of the description, so like if I get a call for here, let's say 2 black males, one in blue jeans and a black shirt, one in gray sweatpants and a white shirt, both wearing dark colored ball caps. In the area of 4th and Kansas. And then I come by and I find these 2 fellows that these officers are patting down at 5th and Kansas, 5 minutes later, well, that would tend to, arouse suspicion. So, and lawfully so. So you can detain property, but you cannot frisk property. So let's say these 2 fellows that are being patted down on the hood of this van, they find drugs on their person and whatnot, absent the, let's say these guys were not stopped. They were just standing here by this van, and it turns out that the van is registered to one of them's grandma. Then the officers could, under reasonable suspicion, detain the van to obtain a search warrant. So they could actually tow the vehicle in and get a search warrant, or they could stand there and make sure that nobody enters the vehicle while they get a search warrant. But you can't frisk property, though, just a person. So here we go. Traffic stops are reasonable suspicion stops. Roadblocks and checkpoints may be conducted absent of reasonable suspicion under very certain circumstances. Racial profiling is a no-go, and pretextual stops are good. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and we'll call it good.